Hi, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Making Spaces podcast, a podcast about making space both literally and figuratively for yourself and other people. I'm one of the hosts, Sarah, and this is
the other host, Josie.
And today we are excited to introduce to you, to some of you may know her, is Rebecca Ching, who is a psychotherapist who specializes in working with leaders, but also working with trauma-informed leadership and also helping kind of folks sort of take their business and think through how they can be leaders that are healthy and holistic. And also she leads a group that I'm part of called Coffee and Conversation. So Rebecca, it is so good to have you on here. Is there anything else you want us to share about you before we ask you the opening question?
No, I guess maybe too that I'm the host of my own podcast, The Unburdened Leader. So,
oh, of course, yes. Which I just listened to 2 episodes in a row because you sent them to me and they're really good. So check it out. It's called The Unburdened Leader, and it really is great work. And Rebecca's work is based a lot on her work with the organization that Brene Brown runs that you're a part of. So that's incredible. So Rebecca, the question that we ask everyone, and I know because we're friends, so I know you're going to I'm going to say one of your favorite spaces. You don't have to say your favorite space. What is one of your favorite spaces and why?
So I thought about this question and I couldn't figure out one. So I have an answer, and you can call BS on it. And if you need me to get more specific, I can. But where there is water, good food, and good conversation, and something cozy.
Ooh.
So I'm in the mountains, but I mean, so you and I just broke bread and had a meal right on the water.
We
had
did.
a great conversation. So to me, water, I need to hear it or see it. It's one of my favorite. And then there's a good meal. And then I'm sitting with people, we're having good conversation that's meaningful, and a blanket, or I'm wearing a sweater. So wherever those are my favorite places.
So you have more of like an ideal like setup of environment. Like these are the things,
yes,
however they are, wherever they are, it's these things.
People, places, things combo. And that's usually when I'm planning vacations, or if I'm planning a workshop experience, that's usually what I filter through. So
one of my most embarrassing stories about life in general was I was breaking up with a boyfriend, and I don't think I was even really sure I wanted to break up with him, but I was having these like doubts about feeling not ready to be in such a committed relationship. And I said these words to him. I said, you have to understand that I'm just a water person and you're a mountain person. Like I'm a beach person and you're a mountain person. And he looked at me and said, Sarah, everyone effing loves the beach. Like, as it, like those are not 2 different types of people. Most people like water, Sarah. Most people like water. Like, we're not 2 different types of people. But I was just trying to create this like narrative where he was a mountain man and I was a beach girl, which wasn't even true because we hiked together all the time. And also, I love the mountains. I don't know where that was coming from. But guys, that is one of the most embarrassing things that I've said.
I call BS on him because I hate the beach. I hate the ocean.
You do?
I do. It's dangerous. Okay, it's very dangerous out
there.
Do
you like water of any type?
Well, I actually have a fear of water, but I like the lake and I like rivers.
Okay.
Yes,
so
I love them all.
all of them.
No, what's dangerous about the beach? Is it like Jaws will find you dangerous, or something else?
That's one thing. There's multiple things that are dangerous about the ocean. I have come to acknowledge, like it'll suck you out. What is it called? Riptides, poisonous things. I don't know, venomous things, whatever.
Yeah, the ocean's not our home. It's not our home.
Rebecca can say that
respect.
Her husband was a professional lifeguard for a long time. So Rebecca, she always had like a built-in way of being okay in the ocean.
So
I was born literally feet from the ocean. So I've just always needed to be around the ocean. That's just something for me. I like it. But I understand that for a lot of people, it's not that same sense of sacred space.
There's people. I live in San Diego, and I've worked with people who they don't go to the beach. And it was this thing. I grew up in Minnesota. I mean, where lake life was my jam, ponds, puddles, we had it all. But the ocean was like the Mecca for me. And I was like, really? They're like, oh, the sand or the creatures. But my parents took me. I'm dating myself here. I saw Jaws in the theater. Okay. So I was single digits old. So trauma informed, they were not, but it was like a movie and maybe they didn't have childcare. I don't know. But like it took me a while, even in pools in the deep end. I was like, no, there's something
There
I
was
can't
this,
touch the
I
bottom.
feel that. There was this
Yeah.
one movie I remember as a kid. I don't know what movie. It was probably a really crappy horror, like scary movie. Because I remember it was like a giant crocodile that came in a pool and ate a little kid. I don't even
Oh,
remember
jeez.
what movie this was, but it was
Wait,
on the TV.
what?
And I was never really scared of pools, but I always was like making sure that the size of the pipes were a certain type of way. I don't know.
No, that makes sense to me. That absolutely makes sense to me. I had a fear of because I was after born near the ocean, we moved to Ontario, which is a little more inland. But there's a lot of really big lakes, very similar to Minnesota. So I grew up on a very big lake, and literally our house, the beach, and the dock, I grew up on the water.
Oh.
But what I couldn't stand was being around places where you can't see the bottom.
Oh.
Because same reason, I had seen some sort of movie where this thing touched your feet, and so anytime I could feel seaweed, I was sure that something was going to take me down.
Well,
So
I told you about my seaweed story, right? I was my second date with my now husband, who at the time was still working as a lifeguard here in San Diego. And that I call it alien seaweed. They're like these huge pods, and
yes.
it started getting around me and I started flailing, and we weren't too far from the coast, and my husband could see his colleagues starting to do the whole get the binos out and check, and he goes, "We will not be a rescue." And he did the all clear sign. He's like, and I was like, "Okay, what does that mean?" He's like, "Stop squirming." And I mean, he is so easygoing, but he was like, I was like, "Okay, what do you need?" And he's like, I'm like, "Get me away from the alien seaweed now."
It's touching me and I don't like
I
it.
don't like it. The pods. Anyway, so
And you have
he's
no
still
proof
he's
that
still,
that hasn't killed someone. We don't know that that's not why people drown. It could be the
my husband
gross
has stories.
seaweed. For whatever reason, my dog thinks he needs to pee on those. Whenever they're on the beach, he'll be like, do, 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 do. Yep, I'm going to just own this right here. And I don't know why.
Hmm,
I don't know why.
that's
Rebecca,
funny.
along with the ocean, one of your other favorite spaces, like that segue, guys, is helping leaders kind of work around this idea of trauma. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you kind of came into that, and a little
Yeah.
bit about how it ended up being in a podcast as well?
Yeah, well, I've been discouraged to talk about leadership and the word trauma in the same sentence. In fact, when I was working on my leadership coach training, and I was with leaders from Google and Intel and Slack and all of those spaces, and they're like, "Hey, what are you working on?" And I shared, like, I want to do I want to help develop some trauma informed resources and with leaders, and their eyes got all big and they're like, "You can't talk about that word." And I'm like, "But why?" They're like, "It's too much. It's too much, Rebecca." And talk about compassion and talk about gratitude, talk about, and I was like, "Okay." And I sat with it and I'm like, "No, this is exactly why we need to destigmatize trauma." Because when I unpacked it further, they were afraid that if we name it, they're going to just unpack everything with their team. If they even acknowledge people have had difficult experiences, they're going to be responsible. And even more importantly, one of them pulled me aside and said, "Honestly, if I pay attention to it, I'm going to have to deal with my own stuff." And I was like, sealed, I'm on this. And so trauma informed leadership, and again, if you're in the interwebs, my gosh, since I started playing around with this 5 or 6 years ago, it's kind of exploded to trauma becoming this trendy thing, which I've feelings about. But really, I work with folks on a trauma informed leadership mindset, or what does it mean to create a trauma informed culture. It is not about therapy, it's not about everyone sharing their deepest darkest secrets, but taking these principles, these trauma informed principles that are in a clinical space, about how do we create a space that is safe and brave, that we can have, what does it look like to create a container that's safe and brave. And instead of doing top down work, how do we create collaborative work, and and helping the leaders build up their capacity for vulnerability, which is where I integrate Brené's work and my work with internal family systems, so they can sit with the discomfort of, I don't know how they're going to respond, or I'm going to get feedback, or someone's going to, instead of looking at procrastination as someone who's just resistant, going, okay, something's going on there. When we look at our standard operating procedures, our SOPs, and for dealing with accountability and boundaries. How do we do that with empathy and compassion, but we still have these guardrails in place? So it's not like, hey, whatever you want, whenever you want. There still is, hey, some of this stuff we can hold in our space because we're going to get the best out of people. We're going to have retention. We're going to enjoy what we do. And we're also going to have that container, just like teenagers that need to know mom and dad still have the rules. Humans in general, we all need to have that container, even test it. But it helps leaders know. It doesn't mean, oh, I've been through really hard things so I can get away with everything. Not at all. It's promoting resources and honoring, September is suicide prevention and awareness month. So what is it like just to include in your newsletter and resources? What is it like to celebrate and honor asking for help when there's struggle and normalizing struggle as the part of the process, and utilizing peer support, and not like doing group therapy training, but really normalizing, hey, this project was hard, or this experience that just happened that we went through as a whole entire globe with the pandemic, this was hard, and normalizing that. So those are the things I work with people on, to take those trauma informed principles so that we don't do harm, but really cultivate cultures that are not only safe and brave, but inclusive, equitable, collaborative. And what does it take for what does the leader have to do, the inner work they have to do, and the support they need to have the capacity for those systems?
It's funny. What I heard in what you just said, as someone who has been a leader for a long time and sometimes paid to do so, this idea that I think is true, is that we have this moment where we think, well, if I know this thing, then I am now responsible for it. Because we've been told everything in the room, we're responsible. And I think sometimes people who have never held a high leadership position don't understand the magnitude of, you feel the pressure, whether they see it or not, that everything is on me, including the mental health of my staff, and which is a false narrative. It's not true. It's never been about you. I am not responsible for people. I'm responsible for making a space where they can care for their mental health, but I am not responsible for their mental health. And I think it's an interesting moment when people have to recognize, hey, like, unhealthy systems make us think we're responsible for everything, including believing that if I am aware of something, now I'm responsible for it, which is not actually helpful for anyone.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point, because that's one side of the spectrum, right? If you bring it up, you're responsible for it all. The other side is, don't bring it up. Or if anyone's got their ish come up, oh, it's their stuff. It's their resistance. They need to figure it out, and we other them. And again, there's a spectrum of this. I mean, humans are human, but it's really redefining how we look at struggle within ourselves and with others, and the work to create spaces that are brave and safe, that are collaborative, means it's going to be messy. And man, do we love efficiency. I love efficiency. I like it tidy. I like it planned, right? Sarah just you pointed at you too. We're Enneagram threes, and my gosh, there's something super uncomfortable about this, but at the same time, it's energizing. And so I think we're in this interesting reckoning of, we can talk about those things and they're all like cool to say, but to implement them is not tidy. But I find it so energizing and exciting.
Well, I would even say that your work applies to leaderships of all levels, right? We can talk about the big leaders in the world and how they have all these stresses in their life. But you think about like the leaders in a small family unit, it's the same spectrum, right? You have the one side where people feel responsible for everybody else's stuff, and you have the other side who thinks, well, that's your problem. And you might have both your parents on either side, or you might have both your parents on one side, or whatever it is. But this is all very applicable, not just to, again, like the big leaders, but any type of person in general, because we're all leaders in some aspect, whether we want to accept that or not.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is exactly true. Some people tap out of their own power on how they can care for themselves, and they underestimate their impact. And I read this book, gosh, back when I was on Young Life staff back in the day, Sarah. And
we talked about that. If you want, Josie, you've got some good, she's got some good stories.
And I read this book at a training. It was a leadership training. And the author was talking about how, when we, how do we want to impact the room that we're in? And subsequently just getting trained and really seeing the world through systems and understanding systems theory and homeostasis and status quo and all of that, recognizing we are absolutely all leaders. When we walk into a room, the energy in that room changes, the physics of that room change. So what do we want that impact to be? Like in young life, in the young life world, we often think the leaders are the ones up front giving the talks or doing the skits, and but no, we can, how we lead ourselves and our systems when we're afraid, when we're uncomfortable, when we're excited, when we're curious, and how we hold space for others. And when we enter a space, we can't underestimate that. And so many people have been told to underestimate that or have never been empowered. And we have this, oh, I am not a leader, is I that when I hear that, there's a lot of unlearning and unpacking to do, because I agree there's different types of leadership. But it's really taking responsibility of how we lead ourselves, our system, our emotions, our own story, our own struggles, and then how we hold space for others as they desire to do the same. So thank you for mentioning that. And that's how we lead from the living room to the boardroom and everything in between.
I think that's such a great point, because how often we have dehumanized people to say, oh, that's the leader, and everyone else doesn't have to own up
You got
to
it.
or to feel agency in their space, whatever that might be, right? Like Josie said, whether it's in a home or, the idea that everyone is in some way influencing someone. And I think
Yes.
that's a helpful thing for us to think. Oftentimes I think we think our stories are neutral. So like, I can come into this space I don't bring anything into this. And every single place that you lead or don't lead or whatever it might be, we never come in neutral. We all come in with who we were in the past, the lenses that we have, the experiences we've had. And I think sometimes we think like, it's not about me. It's not just like the positives that are happening, but also the negative implications, and I'm so grateful for the people in my life who will say to me, like, it's not about you. Like, has nothing to do with this. So, but if you're not informed, you may think, oh, this is something either to do negatively with that person or negatively to do with yourself, instead of going, I wonder what's happening between these words, or I wonder how I can create a space where we're honest about what's between the words or between the actions sometimes.
Well, right. We talk about, impact. And so if something impacts us, how do we lead ourselves? How do we check in with the parts of us that got tapped into, that are still holding our difficult life experiences, or the parts of us, like for me, that want to lash out, or the parts of me that want to tap out? And how do I get curious about that? And that's some powerful leadership right now. Just think if we had more curiosity about our own responses and really owned our impact too. So the other thing that my brain exploded a little bit when you said that is, if people think their story is neutral, my gosh, what editing have people done to their stories? What have we done to discount and devalue our own stories, and how that just lets power, the systems that are in power that are doing harm, have a party? No, I don't. Neutral is like silence. I mean, no. I lived in Switzerland for 4 years, and I learned that they said they were neutral, but they took Nazi gold. I'm like, that's not neutral. Those banks still took Nazi gold, and
Also,
not
you
neutral.
have the largest military. So
Hello,
yeah, it's almost, that's a great metaphor for a person,
per
because
capita.
right
Mhm.
in the cave, the literal cave, like my friend is Air Force, and when we were in Switzerland, like he was like, that's not a cave. It's like, what? He was like, there are planes in there. Like all these things about Switzerland, like Switzerland is neutral, but it doesn't mean there's not a war inside, friends.
It's more than
Feels
the
like a
sound of
metaphor.
music. Yes. Good chocolate, sound of music, and almost everyone goes through the military, has a weapon, and it's one of the least violent countries. But that's a whole nother
Yeah, that's a
conversation.
whole, oh
But
man,
yes.
I do love Switzerland. It's especially the chocolate. Actually, now that you say that, I'm not even a chocolate
Hello, and the
person, and I
bread,
like that chocolate.
chocolate and bread. It's a beautiful
We're
thing
back
there.
to wanting to be with food in the ocean.
Yes,
Now,
I know. Get a cozy blanket.
when you started your podcast, you say the Unburdened Leader. Can you talk a little bit about why that as a title, right? Because titles matter. We're obviously trying to say something when we choose a title.
Absolutely. So I mentioned this briefly, one of the major influences on the work I do is based on internal family systems, founded by Richard Schwartz. And part of this internal family systems process that sets it apart is it really does, it depathologizes struggle. It talks about befriending our struggle with these different parts and understanding that at the core, we have this self or the soul. I often call it the soul, where we have these qualities that when parts of us that are struggling and that are holding pain connect with that self or soul, that healing, or what he has termed unburdening, happens. And when we're burdened with our pain, with our fears, with shame, with despair, it's hard to lead ourselves or anyone else better. So it became very clear to me, the more unburdened leaders, the better, the more that are just pursuing that as a lifelong practice. So that process really what sets that theory apart. Often we talk about having to think through, we got to think through the solutions and think through the pain, but really IFS is about feeling through it and really building up our emotional capacity, our emotional literacy, and allowing that space to connect with our own innate capacity of healing, of our own courage and curiosity and calm, these C's that Dick Schwartz talks about in Self. And then when that happens, the unburdening happens, and that is sacred. That's holy to me. And I know for me that my part of these process, whether it's working with Brene Brown's work or IFS, is we get to do it ourselves, and seeing how that impacted how I led myself, how I impacted how I parent and connect in my marriage, let alone lead others. It was just a game changer to find more joy and satisfaction. It wasn't about the hustle, it wasn't about metrics, it wasn't about profit or bottom line. And it's important to pay attention to those things and own our experience. But we are carrying so many burdens, and we've shamed those burdens. So we hide them and hide them. And then I kept seeing these statistics, particularly with entrepreneurs, around depression, anxiety, suicide and suicide attempts, PTSD, substance abuse, relationship, struggles, and seeing how they were they were already high in our adult population in our country, but within this entrepreneur space, it was exceptionally high. And so I'm like, we've got the most creative, innovative, bold folks doing amazing things, and they're struggling just to function because we said it wasn't okay. It's like, let's just numb it, push it back. And so with this reckoning that we've been going on in our culture, to say, it's not okay. It's not okay to dehumanize struggle and pain, the suck it up, chin up, pull up your bootstraps, hide your pain. We're so afraid of being misunderstood. And the more that I do this work with leaders, like, wow, so if I just own my own story and I sit with my own story of struggle, I'm not going to shame others when they are struggling with it. I'm not going to, I'm not going to have a leadership fail and dismiss someone when they come in with the struggle, because I'm going to be able to sit with discomfort better. We're not, without even talking about it. Right. And so if I can sit with their discomfort better, it's because I'm sitting with my own better. And my first job out of school was working in DC in politics. And it wasn't like group hug time. It was about power, and it was exciting. And so looking back on that time and then seeing leaders, I could tell stories, but I won't on a recording with this one. But you see some of the most names that we know that were terrified because they were so worried about being misunderstood. And that just in my early 20s left a lasting impact on me.
It's so fascinating because, and maybe it's just because I've gone to a lot of therapy. I've gone to therapy since I was 7 years old, which is a blessing and a curse. But most of the time, I'm a pretty unburdened human being. Thank you, therapy. And most of the time, people think that I just have this like laissez-faire way of living life. And because they're like, Josie, how do you just not give a shit? And I was like, why should I? Like, why do I need to hold everything for everybody? Why do I need to let my feelings dictate my life when I don't even want to accept the feelings in the first place? Why am I ignoring how I feel when something happens? Why don't I just sit down, be able to name it, and then move on? It's very simple. People often think of because I'm Latin, people think of Latin women as like fiery and spicy, but the benefit of being in an aggressive culture, and this comes out in my couples therapy with my partner, is I'm like, why am I gonna sit down and stew and simmer and have a terrible week because I'm mad at my partner when I can just rip off the Band-Aid and get over it because I know how I feel. And oftentimes I've noticed in cultures that people don't want to know how they feel. They say they do, but they really don't. People say they're self-aware. People don't really want to be self-aware though, because it's a whole situation, right? To know yourself and to know the traumas that you've gone through and to know why you are the way you are and what informs you. But that's also what makes life, in my opinion, easier to live. I do have chronic depression, and my depression has been significantly lessened since I've known why. I mean, I'm depressed because there's a chemical imbalance in my brain, but I know my triggers. I know what kind of depression I'm having that day because there's like a variation. And I think it's made me into a better person, which I'm not I'm not an influencer in the big bad world, but I'm pretty influential in my sphere of humans, I think, thanks to being informed in therapy. And I think that's one of the benefits of what you're talking about is knowing the feelings and reckoning with the feelings and reckoning with the trauma.
You bring up an interesting point about caring. And I'm recognizing it's pretty brave work to care.
Mm-hmm.
And there's sometimes this message, like, there was this season, right? Like, I don't give any 7 Fs,
Mm-hmm.
and Brene and her wisdom shared like the dangers of not caring at all.
Mm-hmm.
We lose our capacity for compassion. If we care too much, we lose our capacity for, or if we don't care at all, we lose our capacity for connection. If we don't care at all, we lose our capacity for compassion. And it's an interesting tension to understand that if I'm going to care, I'm going to have my heart broken. And
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean I did anything wrong. And when I say that, people go, and so it's that when I am in the place of, for me, and sometimes I'm envious of folks because like I can just turn it off. But for me, if I am like, I don't care, my husband's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's danger. And because he's like, okay, because it takes me a long time to get there. And if I get there, then he knows, whoa, okay, what's happening here? Because if I'm at my effort, I go to I don't care. And I can default to caring too much. I think that's anyone who is a helper of any kind can fall into the caring too much, and it's socially approved. But I think that's when I hit the I can't care at all. For me, that's one of my trailheads to know that my sponge is full. The sponge is saturated, and I think we shame caring and letting it get to us. At least for me, I grew up with that, and so I appreciate and respect the boldness of like I can let it go. But for me and a lot of the people that I work with, that's actually one of my kind of like tells if I get there. And at the same time, though, like I sense with you, I love like, let's just rip the Band-Aid off. Let's go there.
But that's because I care, right? I care to resolve the
Exactly.
situation.
Right. And then the buzzkill is that most people don't roll that way. They need to warm up to it. For me, that's what I'm like, dig it. I gotta on ramp into this. And so, yeah, because it's efficient just to like hash it out and move forward.
Oh, I'm an on-ramper. I know that about me. I know that and it's because of the culture I grew up in, right? It's the kindness. Kindness is very important to me. It is a value that I like in my therapy sessions. We've been coming up with like, what are our rooted values that are the things that really matter? And so for me, I learned kindness, and maybe not in a healthy way. I think I'm learning how to redefine kindness, but kindness for me was you don't come at someone like so hard at first. And so it's always about learning how to be culturally sensitive to like, okay, some people, it's really important for them. Or like my friends who are like, I need I need boldness and honesty. And I'm like, awesome. And like Josie and then my other friend, Kevin, like just, they need it. And I'm like, awesome. And loving me means sometimes you gotta like, Kevin will call me and be like, hey, so I said something like super huge and I just came at you and it wasn't like a shocking thing to me, but it was a shocking thing to you. And I'm so sorry. Like I'm realizing our differences. Like it doesn't bother me. And Josie and I have had conversations where she's like, and you thought that would end our friendship? And like, yeah, it's just because that's the way that I live and exist in the world. And to know that even as a leader and by leader, just as a human, I think it's helpful just to, like you said, be informed of not just your own self, but sort of how are other people and to honor that, right? To honor that, like, hey,
Right.
if this person's saying, I don't care, that for them is a sign for me. Like your husband knows you well enough to go, oh, if they're saying I don't care. Whereas some people, that's just how they are. You kind of have to know. And that, again, it requires a deep sense of knowing self to know the other and then to be open to knowing the other. I think the tough part is knowing that balance, particularly for folks who came from like religious systems that maybe you had
Oh, yeah.
there wasn't a balance. We talked
Mhm.
recently about how it's a balance of self-understanding and the understanding of other as well. And anytime it's off balance, it's gonna be a weird
Oh,
wheel.
then it's just like what we call a parts party, right? The parts of ourselves are
Yeah.
parting with the parts of themselves that aren't doing well. And you bring up kindness. And I had my own big rumble a couple years ago, differentiating kindness from nice.
Mm-hmm.
Nice is complicit and appeasing. Kind is loving and generous.
Amen.
And I can, because I there was a lot of trauma in my household, and it was volatile. So I could be nice to keep the peace. It was survival to be
Right.
nice. And there's parts of me that sometimes still don't know it's 2021 when there's vulnerable situations. It's like, just tell everyone how awesome and smile and they're great. And oh
Same.
my gosh, you're amazing. And then I want to go take a shower because I feel that was like, I'm like, no, that was baloney. And then, but kind, loving, and generous. And I've really been digging into this piece that can be generous with my time and to say, I am going to invest and sit here with you and say, this is not okay. And loving isn't telling people how awesome they are. Always, it's investment. It is boundaries and accountability with compassion and empathy. It's this hodgepodge of it. But man, is the pushback. People want nice, especially from those who identify as female. They want nice. And
Mm-hmm.
man, there's parts of me that go to that F it and I don't care. And I want to give you my version, my redheaded version of kindness right now.
My redheaded version, which
That's
is
so
spicy.
funny.
But
I think it's really funny that I've always rejected the term nice, where I tell people like nobody would describe me as a nice human being. I'm not nice. And to me it was like I saw nice as again like a female, like the typical like demure female. And I've always rejected it. And now I know why. Cause yeah, I'm not nice. I might be kind on a good day, but I'm not nice.
But
and
we could risk losing community if we're not nice, right?
That's
Especially
also
in some
true.
faith communities, like if we're not following the role. And so it takes a lot of courage to choose a kindness that's breaking the system. And so it's easy to talk about this stuff and hashtag it, but to really choose to be loving and generous with myself and choosing to work through something with those and be generous with sitting through something. It's a messy conversation. And I'm like, this is so annoying or irritating, or, oh my gosh, I'm scared. I don't want to be rejected. I don't want to lose this space.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so primal to not want to lose that space. And so that's why nice is I'm from Minnesota. We joke about it. We call it
Minnesota
Minnesota
nice.
nice. You got it.
I'm
You're
Canadian
my
nice.
cousin. You're my Canadian cousin.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Canadian nice.
So, and it comes out because it's like, hi, yeah. And it's like the fakeness. And maybe there's a version of that in the South. Maybe that's the bless
Yeah.
you of the South. But,
But
but
sometimes
I
it's
think,
really nice to say the word nice. Sometimes I think particularly when I've been in difficult spaces where I'm rumbling all the time, I found myself when I was in Alabama in March, it was just really nice to have people be kind, like just be like, "Hi, how you doing?" Like in a way that I feel like doesn't happen a lot here
well, it
in
was a
Orange
break,
County.
right?
It
Was
was
a
a
break for
break.
your
Yeah,
system just to
yeah,
have like nice
hmm
weather today.
yeah,
How
yeah,
are
yeah.
you doing?
You're walking in your
And
neighborhood, hey, and they know each other really well, and I think that's the difference. We live in our, I would say everyone's nice in our cul-de-sac. Josie and I now live in the same cul-de-sac. I think everyone's really kind and nice here because we all know each other, and Josie will get to know all the different people in the thing. I think it's an interesting thing because you're right. There is a difference between nice and kind, and I think sometimes I think both can have their place and can be important, but I think it's the demanding people to be nice is not necessarily It's not great, particularly women within the church structures. I think that's been a fault, but I think asking people to be kind is important. And I think that's been the interesting gift of sort of beginning to understand more and more like, oh, what is the space that I want to be around and the space I want to create for people? And you're right, it's not necessarily like, but we were taught like nice little girls, be a nice little girl or whatever. Like even the language that we use around
Then you'll be
children.
loved,
Mhm.
right?
To
You'll be
belong,
loved. You'll be
you'll
cared
be to
for. You
belong,
got it.
right? Right. And I think it's the spaces that we're creating that, how do we invite someone to be themselves? Like you said, Josie, you didn't want to be, I don't want to be nice, but what does it mean to be kind? What does that look like? And I think it is an ability to say, what does the other need as well as what do I need in this space, and not letting go of one for the other. And it's such a dance. It's such a dance. And I think sometimes
It's
we
like,
get it
it's,
right and sometimes we don't.
oh my gosh. And I think that's the point. I appreciate you saying that, because that's why a lot of people don't want to go there, because they don't know the outcome, right? And perfectionism loves certainty, hates vulnerability. And if we don't know what we're going into, but it's like, hey, I care enough to try and rumble, and there might be an ongoing discussion. It's not efficient, but it's really the most efficient thing we can do. But it's just redefining a lot of these cultural
Mhm.
kind of norms we've breathed in and are in our DNA. And it's tricky, because when we are afraid of losing community and connection, it's amazing how much I can sell myself out when I think I'm going to lose something. And then I'm like, wait, are they important? Is this space important more than belonging here in me and to the values? And now that I've got kids, I'm like, do I want them to see that? And I've got my daughter actually just peeked around here. Now she's listening. She eavesdrops on these conversations,
I
and then
love
I
it.
hear about it a week from now. So we'll see what she says. But we talk a lot about belonging and nice and versus kind, and what does that mean? And because my daughter, she is bold and will not edit. And I'm like, well, that could be seen as not nice, but really is about, let's talk about respect and knowing you're reading the room too.
Right.
Sometimes it's just
Which is
like,
difficult.
you
So
know,
part of the story is her daughter lives boldly on the spectrum.
mhm,
And
very
so
boldly.
very boldly on the spectrum. My friend today was talking about his son, who he says lives courageously on the spectrum.
Mhm.
And I think in a weird way, it gifts us with like, what does it look like when people don't have filters? Like, so his son will FaceTime, and then when he sees he's with me, goes, never mind, hangs up, and he's like, okay. He's like, it's not you. He just doesn't like when there's more than one person. He's just very like, and I think
Yeah,
there is this like unburdened sense that sometimes it's a gift, right? To be able to
exactly.
fly above the bullshit and just do the thing. But I also think, again, I think there's a give and take, and it takes time. I think I'm definitely now, as I'm older, starting to understand and be able to see the times when I have not been faithful to myself, and not
Mm,
held
I
on to
know.
the thing that makes me me, and just recognize like, oh, that was a moment when I didn't hold on to what my truth is. I think it was actually in a Brene Brook where she talks about like, and I can't get it in my head, this idea that like clarity is kind, right?
That's clear as kind. Yeah, dare to lead, clear as kind.
And that was really hard, because when I was reading that book, I was in a situation where I was having to let a staff member go. This was a couple churches ago,
Mm,
and it was, I thought the kind thing to be would just be like, we're downsizing, whatever. But no, that wasn't it. It wasn't a good fit. And there were some things, and it was just the hard work of being like, oh, in this moment, I'm going to have to be truthful, was most kind. I mean, you don't go after them with like, here's a list of grievances that I have prepared alphabetically, but more just to be like, hey, this is what's happening, versus, the path of least resistance, which sometimes is the easiest, it feels like, which actually isn't the easiest, because later you go home and you want to take that shower.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
that kind of brings me to a question that the clearest kind, that's very easy for me because I'm an Enneagram 8 and I love conflict. How do you use the Enneagram at all in your practice?
I've not been trained in it, but I've been around those who are very proficient and done a lot of reading on it. I know some numbers better than others, but I definitely ask when I start working my engagements with my leadership clients. I ask all the assessments and tests that they've done, so it helps me. And sometimes I'll do a little consultation with the pros on anything I should be aware of if there's something going on. But my lens too, especially from an internal family systems lens, is we have all of those numbers in us, that we may just have
Yes.
a dominant number.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really how I frame it. Say maybe there's some, those protectors, those managers that are more dominant. So my 3 aspect, and 3, I've got some 8 to sometimes test as an 8 too. And I know those 2 get conflated a lot, and winging to the 2 of being, I just finished my 18th year as a psychotherapist, and got yelled at when I was in New York City for being too nice to my clients.
And you're like,
So I
I'm
was like,
from
okay, I'm from
Minnesota.
Minnesota, and I was rude in Minnesota. I was too blunt out there. So, anyways,
Oh.
I get
so
that.
I do enjoy it. But I also am very cautious because I've seen, especially like Myers-Briggs and some of these other tests, how people can sometimes weaponize
No, for
or
sure.
put people in a box. So I use it as an internal curiosity and helping. And if people are improving their self-awareness, it's a nice on-ramp for that to explore that. I don't like it when others, like when I first, like, test as a 3, I like went through like, this sucks. I suck. Holy cow. I mean, swimming in the deep end of shame all the time. Like, what is this test about? Just telling us where we all suck? I think definitely had some reactions to it, and everyone like, this was life changing. I'm like, what do you mean? It just tells me these things that I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't feel better. But it took me a while. Like, you need to expand your experience.
I think
of
this
it.
idea of
So
it being
I'm gentle
weaponized,
with
right?
it.
Like you're this
Mhm.
and you're that. And I've made that mistake before too, because I'll be like,
For sure.
oh, they're acting out of their did it. And it's like, no, they're acting out of their story. They're,
Right.
but also being aware, I think for me, the piece that I loved so much about it and why out of all the things, it really has more to do with your motivations versus your expression. So people will
That
be
I
different
dig.
numbers.
Yes.
And I think that's helpful when someone self-identifies as something and can say, hey, this is the thing that is motivating me. But again, it takes a level of you have to have curiosity about the other person. You can't just hear a number and decide, I think it's helpful too to know, like, why am I maybe not fitting with someone? Why are we experiencing, like, I'm saying words that I think should sound this way. They're saying words,
Right.
and just to understand that sometimes, like, there's just a difference in motivation and a different in understanding of, I don't know where you're coming from. And so it's a curiosity to get with yourself. And again, that piece of being curious about the other people, I think is a really important part of it. Like, but I laugh so hard because I've been around places where people will be like, oh, I can't date him because he's a whatever. I'm like, I
I've
don't
heard that too.
know if
And the
that's
IFS
why.
lens. Yeah, exactly. But it's a well, just like Beach Mountain. Maybe it's an out for someone. I don't know.
That
But
was just complete bull crap. If he ever listens to my stuff, I was just scared. You're great.
right.
You're still a great human. I was just petrified.
Well, we do other people though so easily, and from an IFS lens, we have this approach that all parts are welcome. All parts of us are welcome, and we try not to exile. And we do that as a culture. And to really live that though, that's not easy. So they're welcome in the sense I'm going to have respect and curiosity. I may not like them in the moment. Parts of me might be like, "What is going on?" But that's the inner work. That's what we call it, the YOU, the U-turn. Go okay. That flash of annoyance, that flash of anger, that flash of fear. That I take care of what I feel first, and then I can show up better for that person. And it's hard, and you know, in situations where you need to make quick decisions. But I think again, we have to slow our roll, and it is really easy to go, oh, they're just, and it makes me feel better. Oh, they're just whatever number that I get irritated with, which I will not say. Oh, it's just that. And it's easier for me to offload that on them versus what is it about this personality trait that lights me up and I have to do the work on it. And I'm like, no, can it just be them? Can they just suck and be irritating and I'd be fine? And I'm fine. And I'm like, no, dang it. But it is a lot easier to just to other them. And I see it feels very reductive. It doesn't feel complex. And we are so multifaceted.
I
And
love the
that's so
work.
to reduce.
Yeah. There's Dr. Jerome. I don't know if you've read any of his stuff. He's a neurologist and a chiropractor, actually, has both. And he has written a book that talks about how we are every Enneagram. And through trauma
Wow.
and experience,
No way.
um, we sit in one and then we'll sit in the other. And then it's actually a beautiful book. He got an artist to do. It's really beautiful. And he works with
Neat.
he works with a lot of head trauma stuff. So he actually works with a lot of professional athletes.
Ah, a lot
But he
of
helps.
TBIs and
hmm
wow.
Yeah, he's incredible. And through his own, he had head trauma. And anyway, this is how he got into the Enneagram and trying to understand. And it's really fascinating to for him to say, oh no, you're a multitude. And that moment you're acting out of this part and then this part, and to just sort of welcome all of the pieces of you into the space. And often I think that's helpful for us to not, anytime we think one thing, makes the identity of another person or even ourselves. I think about how many times I've let false narratives be my identity. This is who I am. Well, the minute that's taken out, I think we recognize that we're all onions. We're all complicated, just like Donkey from Shrek.
Yes.
And it's easy to exile. It's easy just to, we live in a just world culture. Let's just put them away. Let's just, turn on the electric chair. Let's just get them out of our community, our culture, our society, whatever. And then I'll feel better. And again, there accountability is accountability. If people do harm, they need accountability. It's not what I'm talking about. It's like, it's the spirit of it all. And that's just really darkening our hearts, and it's therefore darkening all the spaces we're in too, when we have that lens from that space.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on and for talking. And everyone needs to go check out her podcast. If you have one thing, we always like to end with is there one tangible way that you can think of that people can make space from themselves or others? What would it be today?
I was rumbling with that in a tangible way. I really just paying attention to what you're feeling and get curious about it, and stay with that curiosity, not trying to fix it or analyze it. Just pay attention. Yeah, and practicing presence, even if it feels like a storm, it will move through. But I know that sometimes takes a lot of work to get there, but just working towards that and practicing just presence and curiosity about what you're feeling and about others. It's the way, and it's a very messy, complicated way, but that's my nugget for that one.
I love it. Well, what are ways that people can keep in touch with you or find your work?
Absolutely. You can go to www.rebeccaching.com and sign up for my weekly Rumble email list, which is launching soon. And of course, you can find me on Instagram at Rebecca Ching MFT. Is a great place to find me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And Josie, where can folks find us?
Well, friends, you can find us at makingspacespodcast.com. You can find us on Instagram at Making Spaces Podcast. You can find me at Josie Takes the World, Enneagram 8 Classic. And you can find Sarah at Rev Sarah Heath.
The Enneagram 8 Classic is not actually part of the name. It's just Josie Takes the World.
Yeah.
I'm imagining all these people Googling Josie Takes the World, Enneagram Classic 8, thinking that's your whole name. This is the longest Instagram name. Well, friends, thank you so much for joining us this week, and we'll see you next week where we will be
Living a space for you. Bye.
Bye.